Welcome to the AZ Political Podcast. I'm Jim Sharpe. Headline number one, 4 Republican candidates looking to unseat Democrat Greg Stanton in Arizona's Congressional District 4 climbed on the debate stage ahead of the late July Republican primary. Kelly Cooper, David Giles, and Jerome Davison, who have all unsuccessfully run for that seat in the past, were joined by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. You can watch the debate, by the way, in its entirety at KTAR.FM. Headline number two, a new NPR Marist poll, a national poll, shows that the country overall is viewing the presidential race in exactly the opposite way that we are, voters at least here, in the swing state of Arizona. That poll has President Biden up 50 to 48% in a head-to-head matchup with former President Trump nationally. And headline number 3, led by Republicans, the Arizona House of Representatives Ad Hoc Committee on Executive Oversight has recommended that the state legislature impeach Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays for what's described as abuse of her authority, selectively enforcing laws, and attacking political opponents. And that brings us to our guest this week, which is U.S. Representative David Schweikert, who covers Arizona's Congressional District 1. CD1, of course, covers a large portion of the Northeast Valley. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And you had actually reasonably good coffee.
Well, you know what? They spend the bucks here, the big buck, well, the medium bucks.
It's a classy
on
place.
The coffee. Yeah. So I always like to point this out to my friends. Can you do that thing you always do when I first see you and I address you with your formal title? Oh, no. Hello, Congressman.
Yeah, and look, I actually despise being called Congressman, and it's more. There's actually there's a slight religious thing, like it's the reason I don't wear the pin. My family always had a thing, you don't do things for vanity.
Yeah.
But there's also a story, it goes all the way back to ASCAM. I did 2 terms as a child in the state legislature, and I was there when they indicted 10% of the body. And reading the transcripts, I realized most of it wasn't actually about money, which broke one of my rules. It was about vanity. And I don't mean to get too philosophical with you, but I actually believe one of the greatest dangers for people that are blessed to get to do what I do, and I hate to say even your profession, is vanity.
Oh, yeah. That's a dangerous pit.
And I run into these fellow members of Congress that won't go outside without their pin on, without an entourage.
Sure.
They want to be called congressman by their staff, and I think that's absurd.
Well, what I really wanted to point out is I always tell him, I'll call you David if you call me Mr. Sharpe.
So it's no longer Lord Sharpe.
Right. So you're running for re-election in what is what's become a pretty competitive district. Paul Bentz of political firm High Ground was here on this podcast last week, and he said something to the effect of this. The competitiveness of your district is the result of the Republican Party trading one district for another, in this case, Eli Crane's district, CD2, becoming safe, traded it basically for yours, and then we're just watching your district's population slowly change. Is that even close to a fair assessment?
The first half is probably close.
Okay.
The second half actually I think is a little more complex because it was redistricting.
Right.
Remember, the North Central Phoenix, the Arcadias, the Biltmore, those are new to me. Everything, the town of Paradise Valley, Scottsdale, North Phoenix, Fountain Hills, Carefree, Cave Creek, those I've had. And sometimes it takes building a relationship with your community. In some ways, I'm fixated on the math and making the economics work, and that's a little quirky compared to a lot of other people in the political class, where, let's be honest, it's a lot of dopamine pandering, and I'm not willing to do that. The other thing that's happened in the Republican Party is you can see the leakage of well-educated, particularly suburban population, moving away from the Republican Party. And now...
And that's a lot of who you've gained.
That's hugely again. I now have one of the best educated districts in America.
Right.
One of the more prosperous and one of the more aspirational. Meaning
at a time
these people
when those voters are tending to lean more left.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the old classic, hardworking sort of, let's call them middle class, lower middle class, tradesmen, those things, which used to sort of lean Democrat, they had union sort of leanings, now have become overwhelmingly Republican.
Yeah.
So you sort of see this shift with what happens when the Republican Party becomes more working class and rural, and the Democrat Party becomes more educated suburban, and much more urban.
Yeah.
And it's parties every quarter century or so actually go through these sorts of realignment. And then you have other aspects of the movement of populism, over, I believe, constitutional fidelity, some of those sorts of things also. But in a weird way, this district is so comfortable for me because in some ways it is what I am.
Well, and it's where you've spent a good chunk of your life.
Well, my whole life.
Yeah. So I want to talk a bit about sacred cows because these are topics that most politicians don't want to talk about. Social Security,
and I do it weekly.
Yes, you seem to bring them up. I think it's your political peril in some ways. So, you don't think they're sustainable, nor is the national debt. Is this your MBA that you earned at ASU overshadowing your political side?
No. First off, it's not what I think. It's the math. And working in a math-free zone, which is Congress, I would argue it's immoral. If it's 9 years from now, the Social Security Trust Fund is empty, and you double senior poverty, the average couple takes a 25% cut in their check, that's immoral. If you're under 30 years old right now, under 35 actually, the math says you will not live as prosperous as you and I have. That's immoral. But it's not only, I not only try to walk through my fixation on debt and deficits and what's going on, but what drives it, and that there's actual solutions. There are ways to make it work. The problem is, let's be brutal, the political class doesn't tell the truth on the left and the right.
Yeah.
Because 100% of the debt from today through the next 30 years, and this is CBO, OMB, joint tax, all the, my joint economic economists. I have 5 PhD economists that work for me, so it's joyful. And actually a couple of them.
Don't invite me to that lunch, by the way, okay?
Actually, the lunch is a blast, and now that we have all of them bathing, it's great. But you look at the information, 100% is interest, healthcare, mostly Medicare, and if in a decade we backfill Social Security. So you look at the 30-year mark and you're sitting at a 120, $130 trillion of borrowed money. And we know what it is. And yet, if I give a presentation on how we can save Social Security, how we can make the finances sort of work, or even the fact that the stresses it has, the next day the left will run ads attacking you. And I would argue that's also immoral. When you attack the very people who are willing to try to save, this part of the economy, this part of government. The other side is also trying to understand everything you vote on as a member of Congress is now borrowed. All defense is borrowed money. All non-defense discretionary is borrowed money. And about a quarter of Medicare now is on borrowed money.
So how do we get out of this? I mean, if I'm wrong, correct me, but I believe the individual taxpayer's portion of the national debt is over $200,000 each. It's not,
and because you also have to add in the liability. And when I say the political classes lie, we have our campaign rhetoric. So if you're on the left, we're going to tax rich people more.
Yeah.
And if anyone really wants to do the research, go to Manhattan Institute, Brian Riedel, and look up. About 6-7 months ago, he did a brilliant report saying, what happens if you tax maximize all the proposals? Capital gains tax, estate taxes, income taxes, you get about 1.5% of GDP. for those of us on the right, I have a whole bunch of things I want to cut out of government. I think we could do better. I can use technology to make it much cheaper. There's a really interesting ethical question of should you borrow money and send it to entities that have their own taxing authority, which is heresy. But you go to non-defense discretionary, you might be able to pull 1% of GDP out. Then that's $300 billion. Yeah. But together, that's 2.5%. This year, the burn rate just this fiscal year is almost 9% of the entire economy is borrowed money. What do you want to do with the rest of it? Baseline borrowing looks like it is supposed to be parking in around 6% of the size of the economy. And I know these are geeky, but it's important.
Yeah, but
because we engage in these campaign rhetoric saying, we want to raise taxes, we want to cut spending. And then you lay it out saying, unless you change how the pricing of healthcare by legalizing technology, curing diseases, change government by adopting technology, doing it different ways. You have to do policy. And the moment you do policy, you have the army of the incumbents, incumbent bureaucracies, incumbent businesses, incumbent lobbyists who lose their mind because you're messing with their money.
So, it's harder. It's way harder than turning the Titanic in the middle of the ocean. It's like turning 1,000 Titanics end to end in the ocean. Yeah. How does it ever get done? Especially when, a lot of Republicans just have given up on this idea of fiscal responsibility anymore.
Well, and that's sort of a little more on the populist side of folks. In many cases, they're partially right. If you live here in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area, and you're not making 26% more than the day President Biden took office, 26% more, and this is as of last month, you are poorer today. So you should talk about to the boss when you're doing your job review.
Right. It ain't happening.
So there's a reason people are cranky. They're poor. I think we need to actually step up and say, and try to understand that. Sometimes the lashing out and those things is not comfortable, but there is a stress out there in our community of people who don't understand why life is so difficult. The arguments people like me have to make is there's a way to fix this. It's not simple. If you have someone saying, here's my simple solution, it's a fraud. There are complex problems require complex solutions. Look, I do these floor speeches every week with all the charts and those things. I sometimes feel like I'm, an idiot professor. But what I'm trying to point out is here's the scale of the problem. Yeah. If you're close to borrowing $100,000 a second. $100,000 a second. Yep. And now I have a few thousand people that get my little daily debt text.
I get it. I never asked for it, but I get it.
But the reason I do that is I think it helps sharpen the mind on the scale of what we're talking about. Right. Because you get people that say, well, just get rid of foreign aid. And then you show them saying, hey, it's about a week of borrowing. And they just stare at you because they thought that was a solution. Or you get the Democrat that says, well, if we just raise this tax. And then you show them that even on Social Security, raising the cap, 100%, only covers 48% of the shortfall. And then you've chewed up much of your tax capacity for saving Medicare and other things, which are 3/4 of the problem. But there's ways to do this. But it's not just tax and cut. You may have to do both. But policy, you have to start thinking about how you revolutionize policy. And you and I live in a time where we could have a revolution in the cost of healthcare if we would legalize some of the technologies or if we would chase the cures. And that sounds a little utopian, but the math is good.
The knock is, on both parties, is the Democrats don't want to cut and the Republicans don't want to tax. But you said both may be necessary. I think if you sit down and look at the numbers, both are necessary, are they not?
The scale should terrify you. This is not the 1980s anymore.
Right.
It's not the 1990s.
Nope.
And it's really uncomfortable to say this, but once again, let's play with kerosene and matches. Let's tell the truth. The driver of the debt right now is our demographics. those of us who are baby boomers, we're moving into our earned benefits. We have a societal contract. Here's your health care, here's your benefits. And we never set aside the money, both the money for it, but also we weren't prepared as a society to have where our birth rates started to roll over in 1990. Mm-hmm. So think about this math. In about 15 years, the United States will have more deaths than births.
Wow. And
yet it's today's taxpayer, today's worker sort of pays today's beneficiary. And it's fascinating. You're going to see a bunch of folks run for office this year, and they're going to treat the public like fools. They're going to say things that aren't mathematically true, but it's great pandering. And that's actually one of the reasons I think I survive in a really tough district. Let's be honest, last election cycle, I was functionally the only Republican really to survive. Even down to state legislators were losing in my district.
Yeah.
And it comes back, I think, because you have a well-educated district. They may not like what you're saying, but they like being treated respectfully.
I mentioned your political side versus your NBA side earlier, but your political side almost didn't happen. You ran for Congress in 2008.
And was never going to run. Actually, I need to go way back. I did 2 terms as a...
No, it was 1994. 1994 you ran for Congress the first time.
And I was never going to run again.
Yeah.
Was never going to run again.
For those who don't know, he lost to J.D. Hayworth in the Republican primary, and you didn't run again for Congress till more than a dozen years later.
Yeah. And in some ways, that was an accident. I got sort of sucked in to become the county treasurer. Because once again, it was financial. I, oddly enough, loved that job. It's more complex and fascinating, dealing with laws that were written 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. How do you be the tax collector, the investment officer, the investment or the banker for 3,300 taxing districts here in Maricopa County? But it was a wonderful education on how you keep the wheels on. And the fact of the matter is stability is actually really important.
But I wanted to ask you a personal question, and that is, how bad does it hurt to lose?
Oh, brilliant question.
Because you mentioned before, we both work in kind of slightly ego-driven fields. Like, my product is me, your product is you. And so when people reject you,
you see,
that's
and maybe
this
is where maybe this is where you sort of put your quant hat on. Look, I've had elections where I've lost, but we knew it. Now, we do really good polling because we sort of create our own samples and those things. Remember, and when you're willing to bathe in reality, you and I happen to have the difficulty where your profession, you have people who will say things because it satiates what listeners want to hear, not necessarily what they should or need to hear.
Right.
You have the political class who often bathe in fantasy. And we have a rule. The math is the math. And I've had occasions like last election, incredibly close, but we knew the math. I think I was even on your show saying, no, give it a couple days. When they're done counting the votes, we'll be there. In a weird way, if you live in a world of sort of data and facts, it's actually sort of takes the emotional ride out of it.
Okay, fair enough.
And I don't mean to sound like a cyborg.
No.
But it's my hunger for this to be more adult-like, more professional than the dopamine hit that so many people around this profession want.
Yeah. Since I asked you a personal question, let's go a little farther into the personal, if you will. I want to talk about your personal story.
Yes, I am 62 with a 23-month-old and an 8-year-old. Yes, which means I'm pathologically optimistic.
Right.
And my wife's wife's exactly my age.
Oh, that's funny. I did want to kind of touch on that because that is a continuation of how you got your family.
Yeah.
You were born in L.A., but
I was born in an unwed mother's home in L.A.
I was going to say, but you came to the Valley in a different way than most people come to the Valley.
Look, and both my brother and sister were also born in Holy Family Catholic unwed mother's home in downtown L.A. And it may
So
be
you were adopted.
Okay. And so my brother and sister and our two little kids, and we're very open about it. We have, we send photos every week or so to the birth grandmother and things like that. Greatest gift my wife and I have had, because some people know of my wife's health issue years and years ago. Now she's incredibly healthy. The decade trying to adopt. As soon as we went and did the foster care certification, that's when the dear Lord had a sense of humor and the phone rang. The little boy 2 years ago, little less than 2 years ago, I'm sitting at the table, what politicians have to do, begging for money, and I keep getting these text messages over here saying, there's some social worker really, really, really wants you to call her. Here's her phone number. I go, oh, dear Lord, what family needs bail money? And we call her, and the first words were, are you going to come pick it up? Huh? Oh, you don't know? Your little girl's birth mom just came in to Banner Thunderbird, had a little boy. There's some issues. Are you going to come? Do you want him? Birth mother said you adopted the sister, the little girl. Greatest phone call of my life. Hold on, I need to call my wife. And the reaction was, first she thought I had bought something expensive at Costco, and I had to stop her and say, no, apparently Olivia's birth mom just had a little boy. And her reaction was brilliant. Okay, I'm off work in a little while. I have to finish balancing the books. We'll go get them. And she hung up on me. There was no discussion, nothing. Wow. And as she says, of course we're going to do this. And greatest thing that's ever happened in my life, if you want a purpose, and this is hard because so much of our society, when fertility rates are down to 1.62, we're starting to collapse actually population-wise. Try it. If you want to feel purpose in life, if you want to understand why you're here, hug that baby, and then understand your moral obligation to make the world better.
It's the most amazing and the most frustrating job in the world. Right? One of the things I love about your little girl was during the inauguration of Donald Trump, she was in People magazine because she just fell asleep. It's like,
she was.
She was like 4 or 3, 2.
Something like that. And I had her here. They didn't tell me I wasn't supposed to bring her, and I had her, and the Secret Service said, "No, screw it, go sit down." So she's sitting, here. We're in the, bleachers as you're obligated to do, and she just, she had her little bit of her bottle and decided, nap time.
It's so funny.
But those hopefully become the family memories. Look, this is a screwy job to have kids in. Thank the dear Lord.
Forth to Washington,
and I've learned how to do homework on FaceTime with her. She's just finished second grade at Basis. Who knew second graders had 2 hours of homework?
Oh, that's crazy.
But it's back to my concept of technology, if used right, actually can bring us together, because right now it's being used to keep us separate and also keep us at each other's throats. And we need to sort of rethink how we use technology, and also how we block things that are propaganda, completely false. They're for the clicks, the bait, and things of that nature. And trying to be a good dad while having a job where you spend part of your life in an airplane.
Is she aware of your job and the gravity of it and all that?
No. It could care, because
you're still his dad.
Yeah, it could care less. Right. I take them to D.C. as often as I can, and there's other members.
How would you do that to those children?
All those germy members of Congress. But she runs around, grabs people's voting cards, and will vote for them. One of her favorite people in the world.
This might be smarter than most of the votes they were going to cast anyway.
Well, but it's also, but from a serious standpoint, it also changes your relationship. One of her people she loves is Maxine Waters, because Maxine, since she was a little baby. Maxine would hold her. Maxine would often wear these chunky jewelry. So you had this baby of this conservative from Arizona, and his little girl's riding, holding her jewelry. And so every time I see Maxine, we first talk about our kids, and then we will talk about policy. We often don't agree, but it means we still talk to each other. And I would argue that's the elegance of trying to make the process more human. Because a lot of these things, actually, it's not Republican or Democrat. It's just complicated. But to raise money, to get on television, to do these things, I need to polarize it. And it's intensely frustrating, because you almost can't have an intelligent, detailed, complex conversation anymore.
Right. Not to turn this into any kind of a campaign ad or anything, but I do have to tell a quick story about Congressman Schweikert. I was in D.C., and he calls me. I'm having dinner, and he calls me, and he says, what are you doing? I said, I'm having dinner right now. And he goes, what are you doing later? And I said, I don't know. And he says, I know what you're doing. You're doing the behind-the-scenes, lights-out, after-hours Capitol tour, and went over there, and he showed me all around the Capitol. It was really cool. But two things really stood out to me from that evening. One was we went on the lip. What is that called? The lip of the Capitol there, where they held the inauguration.
Yeah, well, we went down there, and we also went to the speaker's balcony.
Right. But that lip, you haven't been able to go out on it since 9/11, but we're out there, and there's a Capitol police officer who has a fully automatic rifle. And the congressman says, that's a such and such. I don't even remember what kind of gun it was. He goes, we were shooting that last weekend. And the Capitol police officer turns around and looks at him like, what? And he goes, it's Arizona. And then also that evening, you'd found out that Ed Pastor, who represented South Phoenix for a number of years, a Democrat, solid Democrat. But you were upset that he was leaving Congress. He was retiring because you liked him so much.
But you
personally,
could work with him.
And he worked across the aisle.
Look, Ed was the old school Democrat, not the new rage-based Democrat. He was the classic, I'm going to do what's good for his community. And sometimes, as a more of a free market Republican leaning, he didn't like but so often what was good for economic growth was also good for his community.
Right.
And you could see that in his votes. If you did a little tweak with him, he would work with you. And we still have one or two of those types of Democrats around, but they're becoming quite rare. And I would argue that this thing is a driver of polarization.
Right.
Because
the doom scrolling.
Yeah, in some ways it is. And but I'm also hopeful. Do podcasts like this get viewers? Do the floor speeches I give? Now, a couple of years ago, I get like 12 people, and they were all paid staff who would watch, the floor presentation of, here's how we can save, the economy. Here's what today, on some of them, I'll get several 100,000 views. Maybe we're at an inflection point in our society where people want to be treated like adults, having conversations where saying, it's math, it's not my feelings, it's the math, and trying to gather up approaches saying, is making society healthier, which actually crashes the cost of healthcare, crashes the cost of government spending, things of that nature. Is that Republican or Democrat? It's just moral. And that needs to be your approach of how you find the next generation of the Ed Pastors and draw them in saying, look, this debt is going to crush us. We're on the cusp right now where the bond markets may be the ones who run this government. Because if like yesterday we had a 7-year bond issue that was shaky. If you notice, yesterday interest rates bounced up, and it was partially because we had U.S. sovereigns, actually 3 different durations being sold, that didn't sell well. And they all had to go out at a premium on the interest rate. If interest this year my math is about $1.2 trillion. That makes interest the second biggest expense in the United States government.
Crazy.
So it's Social Security at $1.45 trillion, interest at 1.2, and then Medicare and Medicare and defense are down here at around $800-900 billion. if I had come to you a couple of years ago and say interest will be our second biggest expense, and it's going to continue to get worse, and we'll go through this campaign and almost no one will step up and talk about it. And that is dangerous.
Yeah. So maybe the solution is simply at least once a month bring your kids to work day in Congress. I mean, if you and Maxine Waters are friends because she loves hanging out with your daughter, there's hope in this world, right?
Well, but the dirty little secret, when you see us at each other's throats, it's theater. Mm-hmm. It's about fundraising.
Sure.
Particularly those people who like to raise money through text messages.
Yeah.
How many of you get text messages 12 times a day? Mm-hmm. And, so-and-so said this or so-and-so did. You do realize 70, 80% of that dollar you sent actually went to the text messaging fundraising firm. The candidate probably never saw that language.
Wow.
It's a fraud. We now, on our side, we refer to it as the conservative industrial complex. We have this whole sort of infrastructure that's actually about the money. It's not about the policy. In some ways, it's not about saving the republic. It's about, the dopamine hit and the anger. But you need that to raise the money. It's why you also, we very, very, very rarely will try to raise money on those things because I'm not willing to go to crazy town and lie to people. The facts are the facts. And back to my theory, I think the public has caught on that they're tired of the clown show. They want adults.
Yeah.
Particularly, I believe they want adults who are conservative.
We had a story this morning on Arizona's Morning News about how people are getting burned out on coverage because it's always about A versus B and C's mad at both of them.
But remember, a lot of that actually isn't the real story. It's just to get you juiced up. And let's be honest, your profession, you have consultants in the radio and entertainment world that say this, go to commercial break, right? Because they'll stay.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter, politicians, I'm going to say this, and then an hour later, I'm going to have my fundraising team send out text messages. Maybe you'll send money.
Yeah.
Maybe the public's tired of being manipulated.
I will say this. What's very strange for me is when I get a text message and it says, "Hi, this is so-and-so, congressman or senator, whatever," and it's like, no, it's not. I've got your cell number, and it's not you.
Yes, I want to make a point. If you've been getting text messages from me about putting up yard signs, that really is me. I was out at 4 a.m. this morning.
Oh my gosh!
And actually, my 8-year-old came with me. And sometimes you look out, and there'll be this idiot, standing out there with an 8-year-old putting a yard sign in your yard. But that's
hopefully they asked for it.
We weird. Yes. On occasion, we get where it's the ex-husband who's a conservative and the wife is not, and the wife comes out and wants to share her concern.
Yeah.
But that's fairly rare.
Congressman David, always good to see you. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you for having me.
The AZ Political Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching the AZ Political Podcast with Jim Sharpe. Click the box to watch more from KTAR News and tap the button in the middle to subscribe.